briefly 4 sessions on TEEB for local and regional policymakers. You've heard basically the foundations, and you've heard TEEB for business. Now we're moving into the policymaking context at the local level. I've been co-coordinating this volume together with Haripriya Gundimeda from IIT Bombay, and it was launched in September last year, simultaneously in Ghent, Belgium, Cape Town, South Africa, Curitiba, Brazil, and New Delhi. Before I go into this, I'd briefly like to talk about our role in TEEB. So our being the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research, where I'm based, and our role, besides the co-coordination of this local volume, was the overall TEEB scientific coordination. So that involved a lot of management of the process, but also trying to ensure consistency between the different groups. And because, as you might have heard, all these groups were coordinated by different people, had their different core teams, and so that they wouldn't come up with 4 totally different volumes that are not consistent with each other. Our role was to overlook this process, and it was quite a team at our institute. We also had many, many interns, at least 24 of them, I'd say, without whom we'd never been able to manage the whole thing. And yeah, besides that was the process of the TEEB for local. Very briefly, the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research is a government-funded research center in Germany, focusing on the environment. Maybe we have a very, very strong focus on natural sciences. So out of 35 departments, there are 4 social science departments. All the rest is some variation of geology, hydrology, biology, ecology, modeling, etc. And then we have 4 social science departments from rural and urban sociology, and economics, environmental politics, and environmental law and planning. So if any of you be interested in joining us either as an intern or guest scientists, we'd be most happy to have you. Also plenty of red brick buildings, at least in Leipzig, not quite as nice as here, but definitely an interesting environment if you're interested in environmental sciences. Our main fields of work are water resources, land use change and biodiversity, chemicals in the environment, and health and environment. Okay, now back to TEEB. You've seen this slide, or a variation thereof, and I just highlighted in red the 2 things that I hope to contribute to with these next 4 lectures. So TEEB, especially due to Pavan's way of leading it and of moving it, sees itself also, the TEEB initiative, as a catalyst of change within society. And I'd like to reflect a little bit upon, where are these changes needed, and what can we do in order to achieve the last one here, which is awareness raising and mainstreaming. And mainstreaming meaning taking it outside of the group of the already converted to other areas and fields of decision making where really change is needed, but where priorities are different, or where the problems we see are as yet invisible. Okay, so these are the topics to be addressed in the 4 D2 lectures. Are you familiar with this D0, D1, D2 stuff? Yeah, okay. We try to avoid it, but it's very deeply ingrained. So first of all, the lecture of today on how to integrate ecosystem services in decision making. I'd like to talk about a couple of frameworks and look at processes. I'd also like to provide more on the side an overview of the TEEB for local policy, and especially go into our so-called 6-step approach. Then the next lecture on next week Tuesday is actually the merger of two lectures, which will be on natural resource management and on poverty aspects. I think they're, for many situations, very related, so I think that can be pulled together, because Pavan has asked me to leave the last session as an only question and answer session, because he felt that was in your interest. So if you don't disagree, that's how I'd go about it. And then the third lecture would be on ecosystem services in urban and spatial planning. Okay? If at any times there are questions, don't hesitate. So now back to your question. After this lecture, I hope you will have understood at least some of the challenges of integrating a new concept in practical decision-making processes, an overview of frameworks that include ecosystem services, an understanding of the local decision-making context, although that is probably much more than we can achieve, but at least some initial steps towards this, and an idea on how to go about assessing the importance of ecosystem services for local development. If time permits, also the last aspect on differences of private, common, and public good. If not, we'll start the next lecture with that one. Okay, so the D2 report, what can you expect from it? Well, okay, first of all, what is the idea? The idea is that this volume is supposed to be useful all over the globe in very different contexts. So quite a challenge of sorts to fit that into some 200 pages. And therefore, it's quite clear that it's not a manual or toolbox in the sense, do this, do that, do the other, because that would be impossible. So what our guiding principles was we wanted to provide a source of inspiration, some telling examples from around the world where we'd hope people would read it and say, okay, well, that's an interesting idea. I won't be able to do the very same thing here, but I might try out this or that aspect. We wanted to provide an overview of approaches and instruments, tools, in an easily accessible fashion, and an aid to orientation on the potential, on the requirements, but also on the caveats of applying assessment and valuation instruments. It is structured in 4 parts. First one is a basic introduction to ecosystem services and the value of nature for local development. So trying to sell this idea to an audience that is in a situation of having to respond to very divergent, multiple needs and not per se interested or aware of these issues. The second part is on tools, so on frameworks on the one hand. This is mainly due, we did a stakeholder process. We did workshops in many different countries on all continents, discussing this with our potential end users. And especially in the beginning, there was a high level of confusion that they'd be asking, well, now we've just talked about nature conservation, biodiversity. Is ecosystem services something different? Or is this the same thing in a different disguise? So the level of confusion that this can create is high, and therefore we felt, okay, let's try and set out different frameworks so that people have possibilities of linking these new topics to other things they've heard or have been working with. And then chapter 3 is essentially a summary of what is in here on the valuation, but hopefully in a language that is accessible, and of course not with the scientific and academic background, but on a very practical level. Then the main part of the report consists of different fields, policy fields of application, and some possible types of instruments with local level examples outlining the opportunities, and the potentials and, as I said, some examples of how this has been applied. And finally, the last part is some conclusion of sorts, but also this trying to point out issues that we consider important in applying this, so issues of participation, for example, issues of integrating different types of knowledges, issues of rights, property rights, and how these are affected. And it has a session of some 17 to 19, whatever, I'd say FAQs, so questions and our tries to answer these in a globally applicable fashion. In these lectures here, we will mainly be covering Chapter 2 today, then Chapter 4 and 6 in the last lecture, Chapter 5 in the next lecture, and Chapter 10 between all of them and popping up again and again on the how to making it work. Okay. I think, yeah, the other topics have either been covered. Chapter 3 has been covered much more deeply through the D0 lectures, and you will be looking into some of the instruments. Josh has covered the PES and certification and labeling, so if you're interested in a more policymaker context, so what can I do at the local level to foster certification or to enable my local producers to participate in certification, you may want to look at Chapter 9. And maybe the same for PES. You've heard it from a business perspective. Here's a slightly different perspective, or highly complementary perspective on these same issues. The main rationale was, let's try and get this information spread, and let's try and put this into an accessible format for people who are not experts. So it's very often the origin was some scientific paper we found somewhere on an interesting valuation study. The first criteria we had was to only include examples where there had actually been policy uptake and implementation. This proved very challenging, so we kind of loosened that rule slightly and included other, to us, interesting or telling stories in the collection as well. Okay, now the next 3 slides I'm just going to run through quickly as examples of how we've been trying to communicate in the different occasions to this type of audience, local level policymakers. This can be people in NGOs, this can be people in public sector, etc. So what's the situation? Nature provides bundles of different benefits, and this natural capital is neglected both as a condition for local well-being. So some examples of, in national parks you can have a lot of people depending directly on these resources, and policy makers being quite unaware of this situation. Also, the potential of restoring ecosystems to provide bundles of benefits, like the example from Tanzania, where rural pastoralists are now again with sources of fodder, fuel, and better water quality, especially in the dry season, through recovering traditional woodlands. But also as an asset for local development. If we look, for example, at the situation in Brazil with 89 planned hydroelectric dams, if there's an estimate that sedimentation load in forested watersheds is about half of what it is in others, so that reduces the lifespan of these planned investments by half if we don't take care of the surrounding natural environment. And figures like that 1/3 of the world's cities already depend on protected areas directly to receive their drinking water. Another slide telling basically the same story. We'll look into some of these cases in more detail. Pavan has discussed with you the water pump example. And this is the main focus we've been trying to take, presenting the whole thing as an opportunity a possibility to help save municipal costs. So the example of Quito's drinking water that is now much cheaper, well, assured through 2 national parks. The Kampala example, that's the Nakiwubu swamp that Pawan has also presented to you, effectively treating sewage, protection against natural hazards, boost the local economy. I'm not sure if you've heard the shark example of valuation of sharks in the Maldives, showing that when used for tourism, the value was about 10 times that of killing it and selling it on the fish market. And it can help tackle poverty. Okay, this picture and the example don't go together any longer. We'll look at this Bangladesh example in the next lecture. Now, I'd like to talk briefly about frameworks. Can someone tell me what a framework is and how it is different from a theory or a method? Any suggestions? Yep.
So a framework would be the base from which you start looking at a certain problem or issue, and it's different from a theory of method in the sense that it's free. It's just so that you have boundaries on a certain problem, but you have freedom to look at it with different tools or different things.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a pretty comprehensive definition. So the idea of a framework is really to focus our attention to certain aspects, and then within this framework we can see what are the theories that are most applicable to our problem of interest, and then apply different methods to find this out. So here, a collection of 4 frameworks that touch upon or have to do with ecosystem services. And I'd just like to briefly highlight certain aspects in each of them. You're all familiar with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And this is basically where the concept of ecosystem services has come to some kind of popular knowledge. There's an ongoing debate in ecology and for much longer, but this is where this concept has come to a broader setting. And now it looks rather trivial to say, okay, we have certain ecosystem services and they directly provide input to human well-being. But I once listened to a presentation by Dick Norgard, who was involved in this formulation of this framework, and he was telling us about how many workshops it took them to finally agree between natural scientists, biologists, ecologists on the one hand, and then social scientists on the other, to bring these different points of view and points of interest together. If you consider that usually ecology and biology looks into functions and processes, and social science might be interested in the fact, is nature happening on its own, or is it constructed by the respective society? You have quite a gap to bridge. What maybe is the most prominent add-on to this from TEEB is this, although it's not from TEEB, as most things are not originally from TEEB, but just pulled together by the TEEB initiative, is this differentiating between or from biophysical structures or processes that form that are the underlying fabric of functions, to services, to benefits, and then finally to economic value. And this has proven a useful heuristic, and the point I want to make with this is I think you've been focusing a lot on the economic value aspect of it. I think often in communication, and if we look at the examples, it's very, very useful to focus on the service and benefit part before we look into the value part, so that there is clarity on what are we talking about and where does this come from. And it's also important to keep in mind that, yeah, these are 5 distinct things, and these little arrows up there, they imply a lot of assumptions, and there's a lot of research still to be done to understand the relationship between them, but also we can't really jump from this last box directly to the first ones, let's say. We can't do a contingent valuation study on some microbes or worms in the soil, because people will not understand this unless they understand all these links in between. And the other point I'd like to stress, and I'll come back to that over and over again, is this benefit. Benefit is always to someone. So benefit is something that certain people in society have. And if we have a total economic value, that usually doesn't tell us one bit about who has these benefits, how are they distributed, and who might, and these might also be, this economic value is a balance of positives and negatives possibly. So we might have people losing out with whatever option. So besides focusing on the economic value, it's essential, especially if we go into the real world situations where these trade-offs occur, that we look at benefits and to whom. Did I see a hand trying to be raised there, or no? Okay. Okay, so much for the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. You all know the total economic value framework. I'd just like to briefly look at some of the advantages and disadvantages. Well, one of the main advantages, and why I defended against a lot of the critiques especially from the politics department, it is comprehensive. All types of values can be looked at in this framework. It's also a good framework to translate all these different types of values into economic terms and make them comparable. However, if we come to the practical side of it, it's usually very costly, if not impossible, to get good estimates of total economic value, especially of all ecosystem services concerned. So usually we are more or less obliged to make some selection of sorts, but again, due to its comprehensiveness, it's useful that when we then communicate our results, we make clear, okay, this is only part of what the total value is, because we can only look at part, or we are only interested in part of it now, but all the other dimensions come on top of this. Another disadvantage of operating with total economic values is that in a practical political process, once a total number is out, it's very difficult to modify, and I'll come to an example to illustrate this in a minute. It is also not sensitive to who benefits, as I have just pointed out with the previous slide, and it does not integrate systemic issues. So everything you've heard on thresholds or tipping points or aspects of this nature cannot be addressed with total economic value framework per se. It needs a different take. It needs complementary aspects. And it's quite abstract. So if you're well trained in looking at values and in identifying different types of values, it's a useful heuristic. But if you're maybe a practical decision maker on the local level and not very well used to it, it's not helpful in the sense of a checklist. What do I need to look out for? In order to fulfill such a purpose, it needs translation into more concrete dimensions than just talking about option values or non-use values. Yes?
Can you talk just a little bit more about that? I mean, so if the valuation stuff is difficult for local populations, let's say, to understand, in terms of governance, how do you get around that? And is it just a communication point? We sort of like policymakers and people are interested in using this method have to be better at communicating what these numbers mean, or is it a sequencing point in the sense that you want to make certain decisions sort of before you do the evaluation, you present the numbers, because I think there's a criticism that, and it's reflected, I think, slightly in your sort of point about once a total number is out, it's difficult to modify. I think there's a criticism of this valuation stuff that, when you attach a dollar amount to it, it's also very salient and maybe swamps other sort of considerations in a management policy or local political context. So, I mean, could you just talk a little bit more? Yeah. And if you'll come to it later, then fine. But
yeah, I will be talking more about this in the entire 4 sessions, but I'll give it a try in a very nutshell way. I think the main point is, I mean, this is an ongoing, eternal discussion also within the TEEB group, and it's, I think, no coincidence that both Patrick ten Brink and myself, who are on the policy makers' volumes, are much more critical of the valuation approach than Pushpam or Josh. But still, and as I said, on my team, we've had people who are very, very, very critical of the whole thing. I think there is a big value in having these numbers. And there's even a big value in having non-monetary numbers to start out with. So making clear so and so many livelihoods, jobs, or protein intake, or whatever depends on this is a very powerful tool of communication. And so are money values. But I think it's really essential that whoever operates with them understands where they come from, what they say and what they don't say, because they easily get out of hand. And I've experienced that myself on a little TV interview that they did for me, 5 minutes on TV, 2 hours of asking me questions. And I've said these things at least 35 times in these 2 hours, and they cut them out every single time. And it just ended up being a show with such and such price tag, such and such price tag. And that's what gets communicated, that's what survives. So it is challenging to transport it with them. But if you are an actor in a political decision-making context, and most decisions on nature and on ecosystem services are political decisions, then it's extremely helpful if you're aware of what you're operating with, what the context of this is. As I said, total economic value, make sure you at least communicate, my number looks only at the provisioning services, or my number looks only at 2 regulating services out of a set of at least 6, plus there are the cultural and so-and-so services. So even just this framing it and packaging it can help and can take us quite a ways. Because certainly, especially in cultures like here in the US or in the UK, where you operate in the political arena with cost-benefit analysis and dollar values on many, many, many issues, I think there's no point in not valuing it, because then the implicit value is simply 0. But that is more or less the challenge and the balance, and that's what I'm trying to get at. Does that help for now?
Yeah.
Okay. So this example from Durban, where, typical situation where nature is not at the forefront of people's mind. 3 million population, 30 to 40% unemployment. At the same time, it does contain 4 of 7 biomes in South Africa, 2,000 indigenous plant taxa, and has a tremendous coastline, which is of course also of interest from a biodiversity point of view. So I think it was the mayor who pushed for a valuation exercise and showed, with this quite impressive number of $400 million annually, and this is also not total because tourism was excluded for reasons that I'm not aware of, but some practical reasons. And this created quite a momentum and awareness among the city administration and some of the major players to actually look out, okay, where are our open spaces and what is happening to them? Because most of the remaining open spaces are in private or communal hands and are zoned for further development. But so this achieved some awareness, and some protection was possible. But on the other hand, okay, well, principal pressures. On the other hand, then a proposal came up to expand on the trade port, and showing, operating with numbers in quite a different order of magnitude, and then arguing with, we don't even want all your area, we just want a tiny bit of it, and this is so much more attractive economically. And in that moment, this whole argumentation with economic numbers that was started off by putting this price on there kind of backfired, because it was very hard to bring back other types of arguments. Okay, briefly on ecological approaches. I'm not an expert on this. I'm just going to try and make one point. There are different concepts, and since many of you have been working in environmental NGOs, you'll be much more familiar than I am with the practical working of these, so hotspots or red lists or critical biodiversity areas. The point is, they can be very useful, and they can be included into a setup of valuation by let's start the other way around. This is an example of a salmon habitat. So restoring of a river system to allow the salmons to come back. And this is an area at the mouth of the river, the estuary, that is quite decisive for the ability of the salmons to move into the river. So if they did evaluation of, and if you look at only the impact of these 2 hectares on site, that was quite a low number, and the value wasn't high and could certainly not compete at all with alternative uses. However, when considering that these 2 hectares are quite essential for the salmon to be able to move up the river, and that actually if this were not rehabilitated, the whole project wouldn't be working out. So by taking into account the off-site effects, the value went up considerably. And even if the opportunity costs for, in this case, an industrial area, were higher than this, I can't quite remember how it was, I think they weren't, but even then, you can definitely argue here with the irreplaceability of this particular area for this particular use, whereas the industrial area might be moved down slightly and might have some trade-offs to face, but has other options. So it is very useful to screen these different ecological concepts and perspectives to see what is the importance and how do we include this, how do we involve this in our valuation or assessment exercise. Okay, sustainable livelihoods approach. I've heard several people who've been working in Namibia, Mexico, Bolivia, in countryside settings. You might have heard of this. This has mainly been developed by the UK overseas development community. I don't particularly like this framework, but this graphic, because it's slightly confusing with too many arrows, which mainly highlight the complexity. But the point I want to make is that here they explicitly look at capital assets and their importance for livelihoods, which is straightforward. But besides the financial, physical, and human capital that most approaches look at, they also include social and natural capital directly. So it is a way of focusing our attention on what is the role of natural capital for livelihoods of certain groups. So where does, in this setting over here, where does this dot end? Is it close to the inside, so not important, or is it quite far out? And this framework, unlike the others, does focus on the importance for certain groups in society and their livelihood implications. Maybe I'll leave it at that for now. We'll come back to these concepts when we talk about poverty. Okay, so these you have also been discussing, I guess, in the previous lectures. So challenges to integrating nature's values, time differences when things occur, spatial differences where things occur. What I want to come back to later on today is the multiple levels involved. We've talked about the invisibility. You find some conceptual orientation on all these aspects in the D1 chapter 2 and D2 chapter 1. Point again that I'd like to stress here is that ecosystem services are usually an additional layer of information. I'm on a steering committee for an initiative in Canada, Alberta, who look into wetlands and try to apply an ecosystem service approach with the objective of showing, okay, what is the additional value of ecosystem services? And many of these discussions, there's plenty of local decision makers on the steering committee as well. Many of these discussions are, yeah, but we are already doing that, aren't we? And how is this different from what we're doing now? And do you expect us to do, I don't know how much on top of all this? So you will always have some kind of taking into account, but that might be partial. It might not cover all services. So it's important to get some kind of an understanding of where things are, so that we then can add on to them. So we can't come with a concept and a new tool on top of everything, because that's just going to be additional effort and serve to confuse people. Okay, my favorite team case. Pawan has also talked about this, but very briefly, so you'll hear a little bit more on it now. Establishment of a marine protected area in the Philippines. This is the area, this is the reef in the Zulu Sea. There was increasing awareness in the 80s that these reefs were at risk, that they are important habitat for a multitude of species, provide the surrounding sea with fish larvae, and of course an appealing destination to divers. So protection was enacted at the national level by declaring a marine protected area via presidential decree. No-take policy, with the logic of keeping this area out of fishing, would increase fish yields in the surroundings, but it ended in the typical conservation development divide. So implementation and especially enforcement was difficult, and nothing much happened in the first 10 years. Why? Because fishers were not convinced that the no-take policy would increase their catch, and also not in a position to wait and see what would happen by reducing their catch. So this workshop, organized by an NGO, brought this position to light and provided a forum for the fishers to present their situation and make clear why they were not in a position to collaborate. What they then did, so yeah, the need for empirical evidence that this would actually help and would actually improve the situation, which is of course difficult to provide, especially in fisheries, but in almost any situation of recovery where recovery of course takes time. What could, however, be measured and provided and made visible immediately was the value of the MPA to the divers and tourism operators. So a willingness to pay survey was conducted among them. And with this, management could be improved in the sense that a user fee system was established based on these results, that they were able to involve the locals and the fishers in the management and patrolling, etc., and set up a sharing scheme for distributing this income, and thus allow fishers to compensate for income forgone in fisheries. This then made possible over the next couple of years to actually assess changes, and showed that fish biomass increased, that livelihood increased, perceived catch increased, etc. So, lessons from here? Well, several challenges that are typical for restoring or improving or conserving ecosystems. Implementation is a long-term process. It's usually challenging to balance the different interests between different stakeholders, because almost always we will have winners and losers, and change, especially recovery, takes time. And this information, especially on changes, is often hard to obtain and hard to convey. So again, we have this issue of invisibility, also of improvement. Helpful elements, well, dedication of local actors to involve stakeholders and thereby break up this impasse. The creation of a common information base. There's plenty of examples showing that this is an important step that then allows building a lot of other things on top of it. Transition management, so the possibility to immediately capture value and compensate. And in a more general sense, lesson from the cases are that often over time solutions are found. There is a learning curve, and hopefully by disseminating these examples and spreading them, others can not take 11 years to organize their workshop and achieve these types of results earlier. Now, whoops, stuck here. In the D2, we present the so-called 6-step approach. It's in the book version that will appear next year. It's much more present, much more visible. Here it's basically presented in chapter 2 and then picked up again in chapter 10. The new version will have examples following this in all the chapters. This is basically a heuristic of aspects that we found were important in different cases that we looked at and that we think should be taken into account. So if you like, it's also some way of frameworks or of procedure of its own. What are these points? Well, first of all, specify and agree the policy issue, ideally with stakeholders. If you're not able to involve them directly, at least try to think who the stakeholders are and what their interests and positions might be. Identify which ecosystem services are most relevant, so make a decision on where to focus and how to embed your study, define the information needs, and select appropriate methods. This is a step that, there are plenty of procedures of this type, but this is a step that many don't include explicitly, but it's again, to pick up the issue from earlier. If we are to embed evaluation study, or even if we don't go all the way to monetary valuation, it's important that we are conscious of what is the purpose, what are we trying to show with this, and based on this, what is the level of detail, what is the expanse, what are the appropriate methods to be used. And also, usually we have the situation that as a local policymaker, I don't make my own assessment, I commission this to someone. So it's, in our opinion and experience, important to be aware of what I hand over and what I ask for, and not just say, okay, value this for me, please, and then not be able to understand what the underlying assumptions are and what this is actually telling me. 4 steps, straightforward, assess. And 5th step, then identify and appraise different policy options, especially with regard to their distributional impact. Now, I'll go through these different steps in the next slides. Maybe you can put yourself into a position of imagining your class project for this course and try to answer the questions with regard to your exercise. So what would that mean in your specific cases? Yeah. So step 1, specify and agree. What's the point? This ensures that all important aspects are being considered and avoids misunderstandings during decision making and especially implementation. And these so-called surprises and unintentional effects that then pop up if we don't look at the situation in a comprehensive manner beforehand. So initial stakeholder analysis, or if time and budget allows, participatory appraisal methods are appropriate tools to facilitate this part of the process. And you find in brackets here the chapters where you can find some additional information on this in the D2 book. The third point I'll come back to in the lecture on the urban planning. So there are management frameworks or tools such as the eco-budget that facilitate putting this concern for ecosystem service onto a continuous basis. So to set up information management systems where we can follow this and monitor this over time, which of course makes it then much easier to identify issues and agree on problems. Step 2. So, in your settings, which ecosystem services are central? First of all, central to the setting, so either the local setting, the economy, but also the culture, the society, or the business, or whatever you're looking at. Who depends most on them? Which services are actually at risk? Where are changes occurring? Where are drivers, pressures that are putting things at risk? And how do policies affect these? I think I've made most of these points before. Importance to get clarity on what exactly you want to know and for what purpose. And here, and this is something that runs through the D2, we have plenty of examples that don't go all the way to monetary valuation, but many of them, even if we can qualitatively describe the importance of certain services, this can help to create the awareness that we're looking for. Biophysical quantification or then monetary valuation. I guess in your projects you'll all be going all the way through to the monetary level. Is that the intention? step 4, have assessed. So here again, just some tools and frameworks that might help in this practical assessment. Finally, looking at policy options. I think especially at the local level, there's usually not much point in just doing an assessment. At the national level, it might make a lot of sense to get some inventory of sorts, but usually you're facing a particular situation, you're interested in a certain change to happen or not happen. So useful then also to think directly, how can this feed into possible options of affecting this? So this goes all the way from informing the debate, which is of course the most basic, can be an input in cost-benefit analysis, can also be part of a multi-criteria analysis. So there again, we can bring different types of argumentations and of aspects into the picture that go beyond the monetary or the economic arguments. And it can, of course, also serve as an input in policy choice or design, so determine a tax level or help determine a planning setup where certain activities are allowed or not allowed. Step 6, distributional impacts. We'll come back to this in more detail next week. But again, looking closely at changes in availability and distribution of ecosystem services affect people, and they depend to a different degree. So someone poor depending heavily on this will be affected by the same change in quite a different way than someone in a better off position. There are different tools, and maybe this last point, the spatial coincidence or overlap, can give good indications of where the hotspots of problems might occur. So very briefly, this story again, because we can actually fit it into the 6 steps. This awareness on which ecosystem services are at risk is, of course, the second step. Protection enacted is a step 5 of sorts, even if it didn't compare different options or look into their design carefully. Then the workshop with actually getting a common understanding as step 1, defining information needs, improving the management, so steps 5, including the distributional aspects, step 6, and then after all this, the actual assessment. So what's the point I'm trying to make here? This idea of these 6 steps is not that they need to be followed from 1 through 6. They can be used flexibly, they can be, should be adapted to the specific situation, but I do believe at least consciously looking into each of them before you decide not to do it is very helpful. Okay. We've basically covered and discussed this. Now what I wanted to do, but I'm afraid time will not allow, because if I read this clock correctly, we're practically at the end. Well, maybe you can take this home with you and think about it. What I'd like you to do, and maybe you can do it for your cases so that it's not an additional homework but part of what you're doing anyhow, is to think who are the actors and who are also potential stakeholders. So who else is affected by whatever issue, or potentially affected by whatever issue I'm looking at, be it a mining company, a housing development, or whatever. And what are their interests in these ecosystem services? The second exercise is then, how does the national or any other type of higher level, it could be a regional, could also be the international level, intervene? Are there any mechanisms? Are there any influences? The Philippines example showed an action of policy at the national level without consulting the regional, local. What other mechanism? There are plenty of other interactions there. So what other aspects? What other policies? What other circumstances are affecting your situation?